So let's go back to our start page and let's take a look at the indirect rate calculation report. Now that this rate model editor has been completed, we've edited our indirect cost pool structure, we can now access activity in QuickBooks and compute the indirect rates and show the allocations to each of the indirect cost pools. So we'll click on the indirect rate calculation report. We'll select the date range. Right now it's showing the first 6 months of 2008. We had January 1st to June 30th, 2008. If we wanted to change that date range, we simply come up here to the Dates button. We click on that, and we have all the options that we would have in QuickBooks. We can select this year, or this quarter, or last month, or last quarter to date. Or we can come down here and type in specific date ranges. But let's just go ahead and accept the ones we have. And what we see then is the facilities pool. These are the costs coming right out of QuickBooks. And let's just verify that. If we can come over to QuickBooks and we run a P&L report for that same period of time, let's select profit and loss, and that's showing 2007, so let's just change the date range to coincide with the date range that we're looking at in the ICAT report, which is January 1st, 2008 to June 30th, 2008. If we come down here and we look at the facilities group, we see that the total facilities in the cost pool for QuickBooks is 103,000. Come back to ICAT and we see that that's exactly what was brought into the ICAT program. We also will look at our allocation base for facilities, and that's bringing in the square footage, because we identified the allocation units as square footage, and it's bringing the amounts that we applied in the rate model editor for the various overhead and G&A cost pools in relation to the total square footage. And ICAT is very simply computing these ratios. With what it ends up amounting to is 70% for overhead, 30% for G&A. And it is then allocating the facility pool costs to these two pools in that ratio. 70% of the facilities will be allocated to the overhead, and 30% of the facilities will be allocated to the G&A. Now let's take a look at the Fringe section. We have our Fringe benefits coming in from QuickBooks. And if we come back to the QuickBooks report, we can see that. We have all these Fringe benefit amounts, and the pool total for the time period that we're looking at amounts to $329,453.71. We'll come back to ICAT, and lo and behold, there it is, $329,453.71. That's the total of the Fringe costs that we've recorded in our general ledger. Now we have our allocation base showing. And what ICAT's doing is it's going into QuickBooks and it's getting the balances as of the report date for each of the base elements. So we have our direct labor for that time period. We have our overhead labor for that time period. We have our G&A labor for that time period. We have our bid and proposal labor for that time period. And the total of our allocation base showing here is $853,125.66. ICAT is then calculating the ratio between the pool and the allocation base to get us our Fringe rate. It is then applying the Fringe rate to each of the base element amounts to get us the allocation of the Fringe out to each of the base elements. It's doing the same thing for the overhead pool. It's bringing in the overhead from QuickBooks. Now let's take a look and verify that. But if we come over here to overhead in QuickBooks, we see the total amount as $441,746.96, and that's exactly what we've brought in to ICAT. We're also bringing into the overhead pool the allocation of facilities to overhead as we define that up here. there it is, the facilities allocation to the overhead pool based on the square footage, and we're bringing that allocation right into the pool. We're also bringing into the cost pool total the amount of fringe benefits allocated to the overhead labor, and that's coming from our fringe allocation. So if we add all of those up, the overhead from QuickBooks, the facilities allocated to overhead, and the fringe allocated to overhead, that gets us our total overhead cost pool. We then have our base elements. We have our direct labor coming from QuickBooks. We have the fringe allocated to the direct labor. That's coming from our fringe allocation up above. We have our bid and proposal labor coming in from QuickBooks. And we have the fringe allocated to the bid and proposal labor, again, coming from our fringe allocation above. So ICAT has captured all of these amounts, totals it up, and then computes the rate, which is in fact the ratio of total overhead divided by the total overhead allocation base, resulting in an indirect rate for overhead of 52.42%. ICAT then applies that indirect rate to each of the base elements to determine the portion of this total cost pool to be allocated amongst the base elements. Notice that the pool total agrees with the total amounts being allocated. And then we have G&A, and everything's happening the same way. We have the G&A coming in from the ledger. We can verify. $139,804, $139,804.94. Come back to ICAT, and there it is, $139,804.94. We also have the facilities allocated to the G&A coming from our facilities pool up above, and there it is. We also have the fringe allocated to G&A labor and the fringe allocated to B&P labor, and that's coming from our fringe allocations up above, and there they are. And then we also have the overhead allocated to B&P labor and the overhead allocated to the fringe on B&P labor. And those are coming from our overhead allocations up above, and there they are. So we tally all that up, and that is the total amount of the G&A to be allocated. We then have our allocation base, which is the direct costs, any fringe allocated to direct labor, which is coming from up here, and any overhead allocated to the direct labor and its related fringe, and those are coming from right here. So having brought those amounts in, we now know what our total cost pool to be allocated amounts to, and we know what the total amount of the allocation base elements amount to. So we take that total of cost pool divided by allocation base to compute our indirect rate, and we then apply that indirect rate to each of the base elements, and we can see how the G&A is then split up amongst the various base elements. That, in essence, is the setup of ICAT for computing indirect rates and then being able to allocate indirect costs to the various contracts.